The morning sun crawled over the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains, casting long shadows across Thunder Valley Ranch as Michael "Big Mike" Harrison steered his weathered Ford F-250 through the iron gates of his cattle operation. At sheer 6'3" and carrying nearly 320 pounds on his frame, Mike filled the driver's seat completely, his thick fingers wrapped around a thermos of black coffee as he made his morning inspection rounds. 10 years of civilian life had transformed his once lethal frame into something softer, rounder, more suited to the peaceful rhythms of ranch life than the precision of a Marine Scout sniper. The ranch hands called him Gentle Giant behind his back, amused by how such a massive man could move with such careful grace among the cattle, how those huge hands could tend to injured calves with surprising gentleness. To them, and everyone else in the small town of Pine Ridge, California, he was just another local rancher who'd inherited his family's spread after some time in the military. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. If they noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, how he seemed to track subtle movements at impossible distances, they attributed it to years of watching for predators threatening his herd. Nobody connected those habits to the man who had once been Master Sergeant Harrison, the Marine Scout sniper with over 200 confirmed kills across 3 combat tours. The man whose steady hands and infinite patience had made him a legend. In circles that didn't officially exist, the radio crackled with the morning livestock report as Mike pulled up to his main barn. Cattle prices were up slightly at the Sacramento Exchange. Though feed costs were rising faster, he made mental calculations as he eased his bulk out of the truck, his movements deliberate but precise despite his size. The local 4-H club would be visiting later that week. He needed to prepare the educational displays, make sure the gentler animals were ready for the children to interact with. Sarah Chen, his veterinarian, was already waiting by the barn doors, her small frame dwarfed by the massive structure. "Morning, Big Mike," she called out, adjusting her medical bag. "That pregnant heifer in the south pasture's getting close. Thought we should check on her." Mike nodded, falling into step beside her as they headed toward the pasture. Sarah was one of the few people who knew fragments of his past. She'd treated him for a minor bullet wound last year when he'd caught some rustlers trying to steal his cattle. She'd kept quiet about it, understanding there were some questions better left unasked in ranch country. "Heard some interesting news in town," Sarah mentioned casually as they walked. "Group of troublemakers been causing problems up and down the valley, calling themselves the Mountain Kings or something equally ridiculous. They've hit 3 ranches in the past month, demanding protection money." Mike processed this information silently, his practiced eye sweeping the tree line even as they discussed local gossip. He'd noticed unfamiliar tire tracks near his north fence line yesterday, had spotted dust clouds from vehicles moving unusually fast on the old logging roads. Years of combat experience had taught him to notice patterns, to sense when territory was being scouted. "Sheriff Matthews says they're mostly ex-cons," Sarah continued, "led by some guy who calls himself the Judge. Real piece of work, apparently. Did time for aggravated assault, extortion, the works. Now he's got about 20 guys running with him, threatening folks, vandalizing property when people don't pay up." They reached the pregnant heifer, and Mike watched as Sarah began her examination. His mind was already calculating fields of fire, identifying potential observation posts, mapping out the defensive possibilities of his 1,000-acre spread. Old habits died hard, even after a decade of peace. "The Carson spread got hit pretty bad last week," Sarah added, her voice tight with concern. "Broke old man Carson's arm when he tried to stand up to them. Sheriff's out of his depth and state. Police say they need more evidence before they can move in force." Mike grunted acknowledgement, his expression neutral, even as his tactical mind processed the implications. The Mountain Kings were escalating, growing bolder with each success. They'd work their way through the valley systematically targeting Isolated ranches, building their reputation for violence. Eventually, they'd make their way to Thunder Valley. Let them come, a quiet voice whispered in the back of his mind. The same voice that had guided him through 3 tours, that had helped him stay perfectly still for 72 hours in a hide position outside Fallujah, waiting for a high-value target. The voice that remembered what it meant to be a predator, rather than prey. The sound of approaching vehicles caught his attention, multiple engines moving fast up his main access road. Sarah heard them too, straightening up from her examination with a worried expression. "That'll be them," she said, quietly. "They've been making first contact with ranches in groups, trying to intimidate people right from the start." Mike placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and steady. "Head back to the barn, Sarah. No reason for you to be involved in this." She hesitated, then nodded, recognizing something in his tone that suggested argument would be pointless. As Sarah hurried away, Mike stood his ground in the south pasture, watching dust clouds approach through the morning haze. His appearance was perfect, an overweight rancher, alone and vulnerable, an easy target for men who mistook size for strength, who had never learned the difference between looking dangerous and being lethal. The vehicles got closer, and Mike allowed himself a small smile. He'd been waiting for something like this, if he was honest with himself. 10 years was a long time to play a role, to keep the warrior inside, satisfied with nothing more challenging than breaking up the occasional bar fight or chasing off rustlers. The Mountain Kings were about to learn a valuable lesson about appearances, about the dangers of judging books by their covers. Sometimes the most dangerous predator wasn't the one that looked fierce. Sometimes it was the one patient enough to wait, to watch, to let its prey come to it. And Michael Harrison had always been a very, very patient man. The Mountain Kings arrived at Thunder Valley Ranch in a convoy of lifted trucks and modified jeeps, their vehicles customized for intimidation with matte black paint jobs and oversized tires. Mike counted 6 vehicles, approximately 15 men, all trying too hard to look dangerous with their tactical vests and visible sidearms. Their formation was sloppy, their security procedures non-existent, amateurs playing at being warriors. Through the morning haze, Mike observed their approach with the same patience that had once kept him motionless for days in combat zones, analyzing every detail. Their leader, the judge, emerged from a heavily modified Ford Raptor, tall, lean, with the hard eyes of someone who confused cruelty for strength. He wore an expensive leather jacket despite the morning heat, a gold-plated Desert Eagle conspicuously holstered at his hip. Everything about him screamed the need to be feared. The rest of his crew spread out in what they probably thought was a tactical formation, but Mike noted at least 7 major vulnerabilities in their positioning. Some carried AR-15s with too many aftermarket modifications, the kind of weapons owned by people who thought accessories equaled expertise. Their movement patterns showed no real training, just aggression and misplaced confidence. Old Man Peters, Mike's senior ranch hand, emerged from the barn with concern etched on his weathered face. At 72, Peters had worked Thunder Valley Ranch since Mike's father owned it, and he took threats to the property personally. "Want me to call the sheriff, boss?" he called out, eyeing the approaching group warily. "No need, Pete," Mike replied calmly, his voice carrying across the morning air. "Just keep everyone clear of the main yard for now. These fellows probably just want to talk business." The subtle emphasis on the word business made Peters pause, then nod in understanding. He'd worked for Mike long enough to recognize when his boss was seeing something others missed. The judge approached with the swagger of a man used to having his way, flanked by 2 particularly large members of his crew. Up close, Mike could see the prison tattoos on his neck, the way his right hand stayed close to his gaudy sidearm. "This Thunder Valley Ranch?" he called out, his voice carrying the artificial gruffness of someone trying to sound tougher than they were. "Sure is," Mike responded pleasantly, maintaining his role as the simple rancher. "Something I can help. You gentlemen with?" He kept his posture deliberately loose, his hands visible but relaxed. Let them see the fat rancher, not the warrior underneath. Let them make assumptions about what his size meant. The judge's smile didn't reach his eyes as he closed the distance. "Heard about your operation. Impressive spread you've got here. Lot of valuable stock." He gestured expansively at the surrounding ranch. "Way we see it, valuable things need protection. World's getting dangerous these days." Mike nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this obvious setup for extortion. "True enough, though we manage our security just fine. Got good relationships with local law enforcement. Trail cameras set up in all the right places." He kept his tone friendly, but dropped in that small detail about cameras, watching how it made some of the crew glance nervously at the tree line. The judge's expression hardened slightly. "Police can't be everywhere. Accidents happen. Equipment breaks down. Animals get spooked. Fires start." He paused, letting the threats sink in. "Smart business owners understand the value of additional protection. We're offering our services. 20,000 a month ensures nothing bad happens to your operation." Mike noticed how the crew had spread out further, trying to surround him subtly. Their positioning was amateur, leaving multiple escape routes and clear lines of fire. If they'd had any real tactical training, they'd have noticed how he'd maneuvered them exactly where he wanted them, using their own attempts at intimidation against them. 20,000. Mike whistled low, playing his role perfectly. "That's steep for protection. Times are tight in the cattle business these days." He scratched his head, appearing to consider the offer. "Maybe we could discuss a more reasonable figure?" The judge's face darkened. One of his crew members, a heavily muscled man with crude prison tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward aggressively. "Ain't a negotiation, fat man. 20,000, or we start breaking things. Starting with you." Mike held up his hands in an apparently placating gesture, though his trained eye was noting weapons, positions, reaction times. "Now, hold on," he said, letting a trace of fear enter his voice. "No need for threats. I'm sure we can work something out." His careful movements had drawn their attention exactly where he wanted it, away from the subtle shifts in his stance that would matter if things turned physical. "Smart choice," the judge smirked, interpreting Mike's response as submission. "First payment's due Friday, cash only, and just so you understand, we're serious." He nodded to the muscled enforcer who stepped forward, cracking his knuckles theatrically. Mike maintained his facade of nervous submission, even as his mind calculated angles, distances, potential scenarios. These men had no idea they were playing directly into a trap of their own making, positioning themselves exactly how a patient predator would want them. Their confidence in their numbers, their weapons, their apparent physical advantage was their biggest weakness. Sarah watched from the barn's shadow, her hand tight on her phone, ready to call for help. But something in Mike's posture made her pause. She'd seen him handle aggressive bulls, angry ranch hands, even the occasional rustler. This was different. Despite his size, despite appearing cornered, he reminded her of a mountain lion she'd once encountered in the high country, perfectly still, perfectly patient, waiting for exactly the right moment to remind everyone why it was the apex predator. The morning sun climbed higher over Thunder Valley Ranch as the Mountain Kings prepared to deliver their object lesson in intimidation. They had no way of knowing. They were about to receive a very different kind of education, one taught by a man who had spent years in combat zones, learning the true meaning of violence and control. Sometimes the most dangerous moment wasn't when threats were made, but in that quiet pause before nature reminded everyone what a real predator looked like. The muscle-bound enforcer moved first, exactly as Mike had anticipated. Years of prison, yard brawls had taught the man to rely on intimidation and brute force, leading with a telegraphed right hook that would have impressed someone who learned fighting from movies. Mike's response was subtle, economic. A slight shift of weight, a minimal movement that made the punch miss by millimeters while appearing to stumble backward. "Don't want any trouble," Mike stammered, playing up his apparent fear as he regained his balance. The enforcer grinned, emboldened by what he perceived as weakness. The rest of the Mountain Kings spread out in a loose circle, eager to watch the fat rancher get taught a lesson. Their positions were tactically unsound, driven by the desire to intimidate rather than control. The judge watched with cold amusement, clearly enjoying what he thought was another display of his crew's dominance. "Consider this a down payment on our arrangement," he called out. "Show him what happens to people who try to negotiate, Duke." Duke, the enforcer, moved in again with the confidence of someone who had never faced a real fighter. His next combination was pure prison yard, wild hooks designed to look impressive, to hurt and intimidate rather than efficiently end a confrontation. Mike continued his performance, appearing to barely avoid the strikes while subtly manipulating their positions, letting his apparent clumsiness draw them into a fatal mistake. "Please," Mike gasped, his voice carrying just the right note of desperation. "I'll pay, just don't—" His words were cut off as Duke landed what appeared to be a solid body shot. The Mountain Kings laughed, missing how Mike had actually rolled with the punch, how his stumbling retreat had pulled Duke further from his support, how each movement was positioning the crew exactly where a trained combatant would want them. From the barn, Sarah watched with growing concern, but something held her back from calling the sheriff. Despite appearing to take a beating, Mike's movements seemed oddly deliberate. She'd seen him handle bulls weighing over 1,000 pounds, had witnessed his surprising agility when working with livestock. This clumsy defense seemed wrong. "Enough playing around," the judge barked, his patience wearing thin. "Finish it, Dookie. Make sure he understands our commitment to customer service." Duke moved in for what he thought would be the finishing combination. His first punch was another haymaker, the kind that worked well against scared civilians, but would have gotten him killed in any real combat situation. This time, however, Mike's response was different. The change was subtle but devastating. No wasted movement, no theatrical display. One moment Duke was throwing his punch, the next he was on the ground, his arm locked in a hold that any Marine would recognize from close combat training. The transition was so smooth, so professionally executed, that it took the Mountain Kings several seconds to realize their enforcer was now completely at their supposed victim's mercy. "That's enough," the judge snarled, drawing his gold-plated desert eagle. The weapon cleared its holster smoothly, but before it could level at Mike, something had changed in the air. The fat, clumsy rancher was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Mike's eyes had transformed, carrying the 1,000-yard stare that had once surveyed battlefields through a rifle scope. "Two problems with that decision," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone intimately familiar with violence. "First, your grip is wrong. Second, you're well outside your effective range. But the biggest issue?" He applied slightly more pressure to Duke's arm, causing the enforcer to let out an involuntary whimper. "You brought a pistol to what's about to become a very close-quarters situation." The Mountain Kings had never heard this tone before. Not the bluster of bar fighters or the crude threats of prison yards, but the precise professional assessment of someone who understood violence as a science rather than a show. Some of them, the smarter ones, began to realize that something had gone very wrong with what should have been a routine intimidation. "The fuck you think you are?" the judge demanded, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Mike's stance had changed, becoming something that triggered deep instinctive warnings in men who thought they understood violence. This wasn't the defensive posture of a victim or the aggressive stance of a brawler. This was something learned in places where combat wasn't about showing off or proving dominance. Just a rancher, Mike replied mildly, though his grip remained perfectly controlled on Duke's arm. But before that, Force Recon Scout Sniper, 1st Marine Division, qualified expert in close combat, specialized in eliminating high-value targets. In non-permissive environments, his calm recitation of credentials carried more menace than any threat. Now we can discuss your protection proposal like businessmen, or this can become a remedial lesson in close combat techniques. Your choice. The judge's hand tightened on his gaudy pistol, calculation warring with pride in his eyes. Some of his crew had begun to back away, recognizing something their leader's ego wouldn't let him acknowledge. They weren't the predators here. They never had been. Sarah watched from her position, finally understanding what she was seeing. Mike wasn't defending himself. He was controlling the situation, using his appearance and their assumptions to manipulate the confrontation exactly how he wanted it to play out. Every stumble, every apparent mistake had been positioning them for this moment. The morning wind carried the smell of sage and cattle across Thunder Valley Ranch as the Mountain Kings faced a decision point. They had come to teach a lesson about power and control, never realizing they were about to learn one instead. In the high country, the most dangerous predators weren't always the ones that looked fierce. Sometimes they were the ones patient enough to let their prey walk right into striking distance, confident in the knowledge that appearance and reality were often very different things. "Let him go," the judge commanded, his gold-plated desert eagle wavering slightly. "We can still work this out." His voice carried forced confidence, but his eyes betrayed growing uncertainty. The other Mountain Kings shifted nervously, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of something they didn't understand. Mike maintained his precise hold on Duke, applying just enough pressure to keep the enforcer compliant without causing permanent damage. "Work what out?" he asked mildly. "The part where you threaten my ranch? Or the part where you plan to escalate until the whole valley paid protection money?" Each word was measured, calm, carrying the weight of someone who had seen far worse threats than wannabe gangsters. The judge's face twisted with rage and wounded pride. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, old man. We've got connections, people who make problems disappear." His attempt at menace fell flat against Mike's steady gaze, the kind of look that had once tracked targets through combat scopes in places where mistakes meant death. "Connections?" Mike's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Like the 3 crews you hired out of Folsom, or the weapons you're storing at the old Miller place?" He noted how the judge's eyes widened slightly at this information. Small valley, people talk, especially to the fat rancher nobody takes seriously. Sarah had edged closer to the barn's entrance, her phone still ready but now recording the confrontation. She watched as Mike systematically dismantled the Mountain King's confidence, not with threats or violence, but with the calm certainty of someone who had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. "Duke here," Mike continued, adjusting his hold slightly as the enforcer tried to squirm free, "has a parole hearing next month. Carrying that modified AR-15 would be an interesting topic of discussion." He nodded toward one of the nervous crew members. "And Travis over there shouldn't be within 1,000 feet of any firearms, given his outstanding warrants in Nevada." The judge's composure cracked further. "You've been watching us." It wasn't a question, but the realization came too late to help him. Mike had spent months gathering intelligence, learning patterns, identifying weaknesses, the same methodical preparation that had once made him a lethal force in combat zones. Watching, listening, learning who's really calling the shots. Mike's eyes locked onto the judges. Like those phone calls you make every Tuesday to someone in Sacramento, interesting conversations about moving product through the valley, using intimidation of local ranchers as cover for other operations. Some of the Mountain Kings were openly backing away now, their vehicles suddenly seeming very far away. They had come to intimidate a fat rancher and found themselves facing someone who thought about violence the way chess masters thought about games. Multiple moves ahead with every position already analyzed. "Here's what's going to happen," Mike stated, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had once directed combat operations. "You're going to leave Thunder Valley. You're going to forget about your protection racket. You're going to find somewhere else to run your operation, preferably far from this valley." "Or what?" the judge snarled, but his gun hand had dropped, slightly unconsciously responding to the quiet certainty in Mike's voice. "You'll call the cops, make a citizen's arrest." Mike's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, I'll start doing what I spent years training to do, identifying targets, establishing patterns, taking precise shots from distances your people won't even think to check." Each word carried the weight of combat experience. "Ask around about Marine Scout snipers, about what happens when they decide someone needs to be removed from the equation." The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across Thunder Valley Ranch as the judge faced a decision. His crew was already retreating to their vehicles, their earlier confidence shattered by the realization that they had stumbled into something they didn't understand. They were used to bullying civilians, not facing someone who had spent years in environments where violence wasn't about dominance, displays, but about surgical precision. "This isn't over," the judge declared, but his backward steps betrayed his words. Mike finally released Duke, who scrambled away, clutching his arm, all pretense of toughness gone. The enforcer's eyes now held the look of someone who had touched what he thought was a sheep and found a wolf instead. "It is over," Mike corrected quietly, "because now you know, and knowing means you understand what happens if you come back." He didn't raise his voice, didn't make explicit threats. He didn't have to. The Mountain Kings had come looking for an easy target and found someone who understood violence on a level they couldn't comprehend. Sarah watched as the crew retreated to their vehicles, their earlier formation forgotten in their haste to leave. The judge was the last to back away, his face a mask of impotent rage as he realized how completely he had misread the situation. The sound of engines starting broke the morning silence, and the convoy of lifted trucks and modified jeeps departed much faster than they had arrived. Mike waited until the dust cloud from their departure had settled before allowing his posture to relax slightly. Old man Peters emerged from the barn, shaking his head in amazement. "Knew there was something different about you, boss," the senior ranch hand commented. "Way you move sometimes, way you see things others miss. Reminded me of my time in Num." "Just a rancher now, Pete," Mike replied, but his eyes still scanned the horizon with combat-trained precision. He had revealed more than he planned, shown a part of himself he'd kept hidden for years. But sometimes, he reflected, the best way to prevent violence was to show people exactly what real violence looked like, not the showy intimidation of criminals, but the calculated precision of a professional. The morning returned to its normal rhythm, but something had changed at Thunder Valley Ranch. The Mountain Kings had come to demonstrate their power and instead had learned a lesson about the difference between appearing dangerous and being lethal. They had encountered someone who didn't just understand violence, but had mastered it in ways their street-learned intimidation couldn't match. From his elevated position in the ranch's north watchtower, Mike tracked the Mountain King's departure. Through his old Marine Corps spotting scope, the expensive piece of equipment, carefully maintained since his service days, revealed details that would have been invisible to the naked eye. License plates, faces, weapon configurations. Each detail was carefully logged in his memory, adding to the intelligence he'd been gathering since the gang first appeared in the valley. Sarah climbed the tower's wooden steps, her veterinary bag still slung over her shoulder. "You knew they were coming?" she stated rather than asked, watching as Mike continued his methodical observation. All those questions you've been asking around town, the extra security cameras, the way you've been testing sightlines from different positions. Been watching them for months, Mike confirmed, his eyes never leaving the scope. Started when they hit the Carson spread. Patton was too organized for ordinary thugs. Someone's backing them, using them to clear the valley for something bigger. His voice carried the same analytical tone he'd once used planning combat operations. Below them, Thunder Valley Ranch returned to its normal routine. Ranch hands moved cattle between pastures. Repair work continued on the south fence line, and the steady rhythm of agricultural life resumed. But there was a new undertone of tension, a sense that something had shifted in the peaceful valley. "They'll be back," Sarah said quietly, leaning against the tower's railing. "Men like that, their pride won't let them walk away from a challenge." She studied Mike's profile, seeing him differently now. The extra weight he carried couldn't hide the military bearing that emerged in moments of focus. Mike finally lowered the scope, his movements precise as he secured it in its padded case. "They'll try," he agreed, "but not directly. Not now. They've seen enough to know better." He turned to face Sarah, his expression thoughtful. "They'll gather intelligence first, try to figure out what they're really dealing with. Probably call in help from whoever's really running their operation." The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Mike outlined what he'd learned. The Mountain Kings weren't just another gang of ex-cons trying to establish territory. Their equipment was too expensive, their operations too well-funded. Someone with serious resources was using them to systematically drive small ranchers out of the valley. Carson wasn't their first target, Mike explained, pulling out a worn paper map of the region. Red marks indicated ranches that had been hit, creating a clear pattern of expansion. They started up north, smaller spreads first. Each time, they either forced the owners to sell or scared them into leaving. Within a month, those properties were bought up by shell companies. Sarah studied the map, her veterinary training helping her spot the pattern. "They're following the water," she realized. "Every ranch they've hit controls key water rights in the valley." Her finger traced the progression of red marks. "Thunder Valley sits on the largest aquifer in the region," Mike finished. 9 natural springs, water rights dating back to 1850. Previous two owners turned down multi-million-dollar offers from development companies. He folded the map carefully, his movements methodical. This was never about protection money. They're clearing the valley for someone with bigger plans. Old Man Peters appeared at the base of the tower, his weathered face serious. "Got word from Joey Chen at the feed store," he called up. "Mountain Kings just rolled through town, picked up 6 more guys from the motel. Out-of-towners, look professional, military gear, not prison ink." Mike nodded, having expected this development. The gang would need to save face, but they'd learned enough to know they needed different tactics. "They'll watch first," he predicted, his mind already gaming out scenarios. Learn approaches, identify vulnerabilities. These new guys, they'll be actual professionals, probably former military or law enforcement. Sarah's expression showed growing concern. Should we call the sheriff, the state police? But she already knew the answer. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed, and whoever was backing the Mountain Kings likely had enough influence to slow any official response. "Already made some calls," Mike replied, reaching for a battered leather notebook. "Old contacts from my Marine days. They're running background on the shell companies, tracing money trails. Meanwhile," he gestured at the ranch's apparently peaceful expanse, "we prepare." Throughout the day, Mike implemented subtle changes to the ranch's routine. Security cameras were adjusted to cover new angles, motion sensors were repositioned, and ranch hands were quietly briefed on new protocols. To anyone watching, it would appear as normal agricultural activity, but each movement served a dual purpose, preparing Thunder Valley Ranch for what Mike knew was coming. "You've done this before," Sarah observed, watching him coordinate with the ranch hands. "Set up defensive positions, established surveillance. This isn't your first time preparing for a siege." She'd noticed how naturally the former Marine shifted into tactical planning, how easily he translated military experience into rural defense. Mike paused in his preparations, considering her observation. "Fallujah, 2004, he said finally. "Had to hold a position for 3 days with minimal support. Learned a lot about using terrain, about making the enemy fight on your terms." His eyes scanned the valley with professional assessment. Rural ranch isn't so different from an urban combat zone. Lots of approaches to cover, civilians to protect, infrastructure to defend. As evening approached, Mike made one final check of the ranch's perimeter. His trained eye noted potential sniper positions, likely infiltration routes, areas that would need additional surveillance. The Mountain Kings had revealed themselves as a more sophisticated threat than simple gangsters, but they'd also made a critical mistake. They had shown their hand too early, demonstrated their true capabilities before they understood their opponent. Mike had spent years in combat zones, learning to read enemies, to anticipate their moves, to turn their strengths into weaknesses. The gang thought they were escalating the situation, bringing in professionals to handle a stubborn rancher. Instead, they were about to learn why Marine Scout snipers were considered among the most lethal combatants in military history. Thunder Valley Ranch wasn't just a peaceful agricultural operation. It was about to become a demonstration of why appearance and reality were often very different things, especially when it came to warfare. The first sign of escalation came with the dawn. Mike spotted 3 different surveillance teams establishing observation posts around Thunder Valley Ranch, their positioning revealing professional training rather than gang tactics. Through his spotting scope, he identified military-grade equipment, thermal imaging devices, long-range observation gear, encrypted communication systems. "At least 2 of them are former military," he commented to Old Man Peters, who had joined him in the North Tower with coffee. "Way they maintain their gear, how they establish their positions. Probably contractors who served in Iraq or Afghanistan." His assessment was clinical, based on years of combat experience. The town was changing too. New faces appeared at the local diner, the feed store, the gas station. Men who moved differently than the usual ranch hands or tourists who watched. Everything with professional attention to detail. The Mountain Kings had called in serious reinforcements, people who understood rural operations and intelligence gathering. "Got word from Tommy at the bank," Peters reported, his voice low despite their isolation. "Someone's been asking questions about the ranch's finances. Real professional types, showing federal credentials, making copies of all your records." The older man's expression was worried. "They're building something, boss?" Mike nodded, having expected this development. "They're establishing pressure points," he explained, continuing his surveillance. "Financial records, property documents, water rights, looking for legal vulnerabilities they can exploit." It was a sophisticated approach, combining legitimate business pressure with criminal intimidation. Sarah arrived around mid-morning, ostensibly to check on the pregnant heifer, but actually bringing intelligence from town. "They've rented the entire 3rd floor of the Pine Ridge Hotel," she reported, joining them in the tower. "At least 12 men, all former military by the look of them. Someone's spending serious money on this operation." Through his scope, Mike observed one of the surveillance teams rotating positions, their movement patterns confirming his suspicions about their training. "They're good," he acknowledged. "Professional, patient. This won't be like the first confrontation." His voice carried grudging respect for their tactical discipline. The day progressed with careful choreography on both sides. The surveillance teams maintained their observation, gathering intelligence on the ranch's routine. Mike allowed them to see exactly what he wanted: normal agricultural operations, standard security measures, nothing that would suggest preparation for serious conflict. But beneath the peaceful surface, Thunder Valley Ranch was transforming. Ranch hands casually repositioned equipment to create cover and defensive positions. Irrigation patterns were subtly altered to make certain approaches more difficult. Every routine task served a dual purpose: preparing the battlefield while maintaining perfect deniability. "They're mapping our camera coverage," Mike noted, watching one team probe the ranch's security systems, testing response times, identifying blind spots. He made minor adjustments to their security setup deliberately, leaving small vulnerabilities that would shape future confrontations. Around noon, the pressure increased. A county building inspector arrived, accompanied by two men whose suits couldn't quite hide their military bearing. They spent hours examining every structure, documenting alleged code violations, creating official pretexts for further interference. "Found some serious concerns," the inspector announced, though his nervous glances at his escorts revealed who was really in charge. "We'll need to conduct a more thorough investigation. Some of these buildings may need to be condemned." The threat was clear. Legal pressure would continue mounting until the ranch became impossible to operate. Mike played his role perfectly, appearing frustrated but helpless against official authority. But his trained eye noted how the officials moved, how they used the inspection to map the ranch's layout, identifying tactical advantages and potential weaknesses. Sarah watched the inspection from the barn, her concern growing. "They're not just gathering intelligence," she observed quietly when the officials finally left. "They're preparing for something specific. All this pressure, the surveillance, the legal complications, they're building toward something." "Tonight," Mike confirmed, his voice certain. "They've established observation posts, mapped our security, created official cover for their presence. Classic preparation for a night operation." He began making final adjustments to their preparations, each movement calculated and precise. The afternoon brought more pressure. Bank officials called about irregularities in the ranch's accounts. The power company reported the need for emergency maintenance that would require shutting off electricity to the property. Water rights administrators announced an urgent audit of the ranch's usage. "They're isolating us," Old Man Peters realized, watching another official vehicle approach the ranch. "Cutting off support, creating confusion, establishing legitimate reasons for disrupting normal operations." Mike nodded, recognizing the sophisticated strategy. "Standard tactics for this kind of operation: create multiple pressure points, maintain deniability, wear down resistance through legitimate channels while preparing for direct action." His voice carried the experience of someone who had seen similar operations in combat zones. As evening approached, the surveillance teams adjusted their positions, establishing optimal observation posts for night operations. Their movement patterns confirmed Mike's assessment. They were preparing for a significant action under cover of darkness. Through his spotting scope, Mike identified new equipment being moved into position: tactical gear, specialized night vision devices, communication systems that suggested coordination between multiple teams. The Mountain Kings had upgraded from gang intimidation to professional military-style operations. "You're sure about tonight?" Sarah asked, helping him make final preparations that looked like normal end-of-day ranch work. The concern in her voice wasn't just for the ranch, but for the man who had become her friend. Mike's expression was calm, focused. "They'll want to move fast now before we can gather support or strengthen defenses. Their surveillance is complete, they've established legal cover, and they've positioned their assets. Tonight's perfect for them. New moon, clear weather, excellent conditions for night operations." The sun began setting over Thunder Valley Ranch, casting long shadows that would soon provide perfect cover for tactical movement. To anyone watching, the ranch appeared to be settling into normal evening routine. But beneath the peaceful surface, years of combat experience had prepared a reception that the Mountain King's professional contractors never expected to encounter on a simple ranch intimidation operation. Darkness settled over Thunder Valley. Ranch like a tactical blanket, perfect conditions for the operation Mike knew was coming. Through his thermal scope, he tracked multiple teams moving into position around the property. Their movement patterns were professional, coordinated. Nothing like the Mountain King's usual crude intimidation tactics. 8-man teams, 3 different entry points, he murmured into his encrypted radio, a relic from his Marine days that Sarah had helped him modify. Military-grade night vision, tactical gear, sophisticated communication systems. These aren't gang members anymore. His assessment was meant for Old Man Peters and the handful of trusted ranch hands positioned throughout the property. The ranch appeared quiet, peaceful, exactly what the surveillance teams had observed for the past day. But Mike had spent years in combat zones learning how to prepare battlefields while appearing to do nothing. Every parked tractor, every pile of hay bales, every seemingly random piece of equipment had been carefully positioned to create fields of fire and defensive positions. "Power's out!" Sarah's voice crackled through the radio from her position in the barn's medical office. The electricity had cut exactly when Mike predicted, a technical failure that would provide cover for the operation while disrupting security systems. Except Mike had anticipated this, had prepared for it long before the Mountain Kings ever appeared in the valley. Through his thermal imaging, Mike watched the professional contractors begin their approach. Their formation was textbook. Special operations using terrain features for cover, maintaining perfect spacing and communication. These were men who had served in combat zones, who understood tactical movement and coordinated action. "They're good," he acknowledged quietly to Peters, who was positioned nearby with a night vision monocular. "Probably private military contractors. Maybe some former special forces, expensive talent for a simple ranch intimidation." His voice carried grudging professional respect, even as he noted their positions, their patterns, their likely objectives. The first team breached the outer perimeter. At exactly 11:47 p.m., their movement silent and precise. They encountered no resistance, found exactly the vulnerabilities their surveillance had identified. Everything was going perfectly according to their plan, which meant they were walking directly into Mike's. "Remember," his voice whispered through the radio to his positioned ranch hands, "no heroes, no direct confrontation. We're not trying to fight them. We're showing them why this isn't worth their time." Each trusted employee had been carefully briefed, given specific roles that played to their strengths while maintaining perfect deniability. The contractor's first indication that something was wrong came when their supposedly compromised security cameras suddenly activated, flooding key approaches with bright light. It was a simple tactic, one Mike had learned in urban combat. Light doesn't just illuminate, it destroys night vision advantage and creates confusion. "Team 2, check in," a professional voice crackled through the contractor's communications, which Mike monitored through equipment that would have surprised his observers. The response was immediate, but showed the first traces of uncertainty. "Something's wrong. Security systems are still active, different configuration than our intel showed." Mike allowed himself a small smile. Every piece of surveillance the contractors had gathered over the past day had been carefully crafted, showing them exactly what he wanted them to see. Now that false intelligence was becoming a liability, making them question their careful planning. The second team encountered their own complications. The irrigation system activated unexpectedly, turning their carefully chosen approach route into muddy terrain that negated their tactical advantage. It wasn't enough to stop trained operators, but it slowed them down, disrupted their timing, created doubt. "These aren't random defenses," one operator muttered through their command channel. "Someone's anticipated our approach vectors, prepared specific countermeasures." The professional assessment carried growing concern. They had expected to encounter an upgraded security system, not face countermeasures that suggested combat experience. Through his thermal scope, Mike watched their formation begin to fragment. Not obviously, not unprofessionally, but the subtle signs were there. Increased hesitation at decision points, overchecking of positions, the gradual loss of offensive momentum that came with growing uncertainty. "They're starting to understand," he commented to Peters, realizing this isn't the simple operation their surveillance suggested. "Now we show them exactly why they should reconsider their contract." His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years learning how to shape battlefields to his advantage. The third team encountered their own, carefully prepared surprise when they tried to breach the barn's side entrance. The door opened easily, exactly as their intelligence suggested it would. But instead of accessing a vulnerable entry point, they found themselves facing a maze of equipment and machinery that channeled movement in specific directions, creating a tactical nightmare of potential ambush points. This whole setup, one contractor's voice carried clear frustration through their communications. "It's like someone designed it specifically to counter our approach. Every alternate route, every backup plan, they're all compromised." The growing realization that they were dealing with someone who understood their tactics was spreading through their teams. Mike keyed his radio, voice calm as he issued new instructions to his positioned ranch hands. Each new defensive measure was designed not to defeat the contractors directly, but to demonstrate that someone had anticipated and prepared for every aspect of their operation. The contractors were professionals, their training and experience obvious in how they adapted to each new complication. But Mike had spent years in combat zones learning that the most effective defense isn't always about winning fights. Sometimes it's about making the enemy realize that the cost of victory isn't worth the potential gain. As midnight approached, Thunder Valley Ranch had become a demonstration of why appearance and reality were often very different things, especially in combat. The contractors had come prepared for an upgraded security system, for amateur resistance, for the typical defenses of a wealthy property owner. Instead, they were facing something their surveillance hadn't detected, their intelligence hadn't prepared them for, a battlefield shaped by someone who understood exactly how they thought, how they moved, how they operated. Someone who had spent years in combat zones, learning that the most effective resistance often wasn't about fighting at all, but about making the enemy question whether the fight was worth having. The contractor's operation continued to unravel in subtle but significant ways. Their command channel crackled with increasing frustration as each team encountered specific countermeasures that seemed impossibly well suited to their tactics. Through his thermal scope, Mike watched their professional discipline begin to show. "It cracks! All teams hold position," their commander ordered, his voice carrying the tension of someone realizing they'd walked into something they didn't understand. "Something's not right here. Our intel was too perfect, too easy. Someone wanted us to choose exactly these approach vectors." Mike switched observation positions with the same fluid silence that had once made him a legend among scout snipers. Each contractor team was now exactly where he'd planned, their movements restricted by carefully positioned equipment and deliberately created obstacles. They remained dangerous. Trained operators didn't lose their skills just because plans went wrong, but their tactical advantage was evaporating. "Think about it," Mike murmured into his encrypted radio, knowing the contractors could hear his transmission but not trace or decode it. Every security measure you identified during surveillance, exactly what you expected to find. Every vulnerability you discovered, precisely where you needed it to be. Almost like someone with tactical experience wanted you to plan this specific operation. The effect of his words on the contractors' communications was immediate. Their command channel erupted with quick professional exchanges as they reassessed their situation. These weren't amateur gangsters who would panic at the first sign of resistance. They were experienced operators who recognized when they'd been expertly manipulated. Possible hostile with military background, one team leader reported, his voice tight with professional concern. Pattern suggests advanced tactical training, probably special operations experience. This whole setup, it's a textbook example of using terrain and intelligence to shape enemy movement. Sarah's voice came through Mike's radio from her position in the barn. Multiple vehicles approaching from the North Access Road. Looks like the Mountain Kings bringing in reinforcements. Her tone carried quiet confidence. Everything was proceeding exactly as Mike had predicted. "Let them come," Mike replied calmly. Their professional contractors just spent the last hour learning this isn't a normal ranch. Now they get to watch their employers walk into the same realization. His voice carried the patience of a sniper who had spent countless hours waiting for targets to move exactly where he wanted them. The Mountain Kings arrived with their usual aggressive display, engines roaring, lights blazing, all the theatrical intimidation that had worked so well against ordinary ranchers. The judge's voice boomed through the night, carried by professional-grade loudspeakers. "Time to end this, fat man. No more games, no more hiding behind fancy security." Through his thermal scope, Mike watched the contractors' reaction to their employer's arrival. Their body language showed professional dismay at such crude tactics, at the disruption of their careful operation. More importantly, he noted how they maintained their positions, not rushing to support the gang's direct approach. They had learned enough to be cautious. "Boss," Old Man Peters whispered through the radio, "they're splitting up. Gangs moving straight in, but their professionals are holding back, watching. They know something's wrong." The older man's voice carried quiet admiration for the tactical situation Mike had created. The Mountain Kings advanced toward the main house, their confidence bolstered by numbers and weapons. But with each step, they entered deeper into a battlefield that had been prepared specifically for this moment. Motion sensors triggered seemingly random equipment activations. Lights blazed and died in patterns that destroyed night vision, and carefully positioned speakers created disorienting echoes. "What the hell is this?" The judge's voice had lost some of its certainty. His men were bunching up, their formation deteriorating as they encountered obstacles that shouldn't have been there, defenses that didn't make sense for a simple ranch. Mike's voice carried clearly through the night, broadcast through the ranch's emergency announcement system. "Interesting choice," he commented casually, "bringing in professional contractors, former military, probably special operations background. Smart move, showing you understand the real nature of our situation." The effect of his words was immediate. The Mountain Kings' advance faltered as they realized their supposedly secret tactical team had been identified. More importantly, the contractors themselves recognized the significance of being so easily made. They were facing someone with serious military experience. "But here's what you don't understand," Mike continued, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had once guided Marine combat operations. "Those professionals you hired, they've spent the last hour learning exactly what they're dealing with. Why don't you ask them if they think this operation is worth continuing?" Through his thermal scope, Mike watched the contractor's command channel light up with urgent communications. They had finally pieced together enough to understand the full tactical situation, how every move they'd made had been anticipated, how their careful planning had been turned against them, how they'd been drawn into exactly the positions someone with advanced combat experience would want them. "Sir," one contractor's voice cut through their encrypted channel, now compromised by Mike's specialized equipment, "recommend immediate withdrawal. Target has military background, probably special operations. Entire property is a prepared defensive position. We're facing someone who knows exactly how we think, how we move, how we operate." The night air carried growing tension as the Mountain Kings faced a decision point. Their professional contractors had just confirmed what Mike wanted them to know. They weren't dealing with a simple rancher who had bought good security. They were facing someone who understood combat on their level, who had prepared for this confrontation with the same tactical precision they prided themselves on. Thunder Valley Ranch had become more than a battlefield. It was a demonstration of why appearance and reality could be very different things, especially when dealing with someone who had spent years in combat zones, learning how to shape confrontations to their advantage. The Mountain Kings had brought in professionals to solve their problem, never realizing they were providing exactly the audience Mike needed, operators who would recognize and respect the true nature of what they were facing. The judge's response to the deteriorating situation revealed his lack of real combat experience. "Push forward," he commanded, his voice carrying more bravado than tactical sense. "We've got them outnumbered. They can't stop all of us." But his professional contractors remained in their positions, their training and experience telling them something their employer couldn't understand. Through his thermal scope, Mike tracked both groups, the increasingly uncertain gang members and their more professional backup. The contractors' command channel had gone almost silent, their communications limited to essential tactical updates as they reassessed their situation. They were starting to piece together the fuller picture, understanding exactly what kind of operation they'd walked into. "Your contractors aren't moving," Mike's voice carried clearly through the night, broadcast to create subtle echoes that made his position impossible to pinpoint. "Want to know why? Because they recognize what's happening here. They understand that every move they've made tonight was anticipated, planned for, turned against them. Ask them what that means." Sarah's voice came through his encrypted channel, quiet but urgent. "More vehicles approaching from the county road. Local sheriffs. Department looks like state police too." The timing was perfect, exactly as Mike had arranged through his old Marine Corps contacts. The contractors noticed the approaching law enforcement first. Their thermal imaging would show multiple vehicles establishing containment positions around the valley. To their trained eyes, the pattern would be clear. This wasn't a routine police response, but a coordinated operation being conducted by people with tactical experience. "Command, we have multiple law enforcement units moving into blocking positions," one contractor reported through their channel. "Pattern suggests coordinated response, probably federal oversight. This whole thing, it's been a setup from the start." The professional assessment carried growing respect for the operation they'd walked into. The Mountain Kings were slower to realize the trap they'd sprung, still advancing toward the ranch house with misplaced confidence in their numbers and weapons. Mike let them come, watching through his scope as they entered exactly the position he'd spent months preparing for. "Last chance," he broadcast, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once directed combat operations. "Your professional backup has already figured it out. This isn't just a ranch, and I'm not just a rancher. Those law enforcement units moving into position, they're being coordinated by people who understand exactly what you're really doing in this valley." The judge's response was predictably aggressive. "You think some local cops scare us? We own this valley. We've got connections you can't touch." His shouted defiance echoed oddly through the carefully positioned speakers, creating disorientation among his men. Mike's reply was measured, precise. "Those connections, like the ones coordinating your operation from Sacramento, the shell companies buying up ranches, the classified military equipment being moved through supposedly abandoned properties. Each revelation landed like a precise shot, demonstrating just how completely their operation had been compromised." Through his thermal scope, Mike watched the contractors' reaction to this intelligence. Their body language showed professional recognition of how thoroughly they'd been drawn into someone else's operation. More importantly, they were starting to understand their role, not just as tactical support, but as intended witnesses to what was about to happen. Your employers didn't tell you everything, Mike continued, addressing the contractors directly through their own communication channel. They didn't mention that this valley's been under federal investigation for months, that every ranch you've intimidated has been documented, every shipment tracked, every connection traced. They hired you to provide tactical support for what they thought was a simple land grab. Instead, they made you witnesses to a RICO operation. The effect of his words was immediate. The contractor's command channel erupted with urgent communications. As they realized the full implications of their involvement, they weren't just facing a prepared defensive position. They had been drawn into a federal investigation that could compromise their future operations, their contracts, their careers. All teams begin immediate withdrawal, their commander ordered. Professionalism warring with urgency. Maintain tactical spacing, establish deniable distance from primary target group. The order confirmed what Mike had intended. The professionals were separating themselves from what they now recognized as a compromised operation. The Mountain Kings, less experienced in reading tactical situations, failed to understand the significance of their contractor's retreat. The judge's voice carried growing desperation as he tried to rally his men. "They're falling back to better positions. Keep pushing forward. We'll show this fat farmer what real power looks like." Mike's next broadcast carried a different tone. Not the calm authority of before, but the precise delivery of someone presenting evidence. "Ricardo the Judge Martinez," he recited, "wanted in 3 states for extortion and organized crime. Currently operating under instructions from Marcus Wheeler, former military contractor now running classified equipment through supposedly abandoned properties." The names landed like precise shots, each one revealing more of the operation the Mountain Kings thought was secret. Through his scope, Mike watched the gang members' confidence crumble as they realized how completely their organization had been compromised. Sarah's voice provided final confirmation through his radio. "Federal tactical teams are in position. State police have sealed all valley access points. Everything's recorded and documented, just like you planned." Her tone carried quiet amazement at how perfectly the operation had come together. Thunder Valley Ranch had become more than a battlefield. It was the culmination of months of careful preparation, the springing of a trap that had been baited, with exactly the right mix of apparent vulnerability and hidden strength. The Mountain Kings had brought in professional contractors to solve their problem, never realizing they were providing the perfect witnesses to their own undoing. Through his thermal scope, Mike watched the night's operation reach its critical point. The gang members were starting to understand their situation. Their professional backup was withdrawing, and law enforcement was moving into position. Everything had proceeded exactly as he'd planned, using his combat experience not to fight, but to shape events so that fighting became unnecessary. The final phase of Mike's operation unfolded with the precision of a well-planned military strike. Through his thermal scope, he watched the judge's remaining bravado crumble as federal tactical teams began announcing their presence, their vehicles' lights painting the valley in red and blue pulses. The Mountain Kings' attempted show of force had transformed into something else entirely, documented evidence of criminal conspiracy reaching far beyond a simple local gang. "All units in position," crackled the federal tactical channel that Mike monitored through his specialized equipment. "Target area contained, all escape routes blocked, primary suspects identified and tracked." The professional precision of the federal response stood in sharp contrast to the gang's now chaotic movements. Their attempts at military-style organization dissolving into panicked confusion. The judge's voice carried rising panic as he finally began to understand his situation. "Fall back! Everyone fall back!" But his retreat order came too late. His men found themselves caught in the carefully prepared channels that Mike had spent months creating, paths that seemed to offer escape, but actually led directly into law enforcement containment positions. Each attempted escape route had been methodically prepared, transformed into a documented evidence trail that would connect street-level gang activity to much larger criminal enterprises. Interesting thing about valleys, Mike broadcast one final time, his voice carrying across the ranch with the calm authority that had once directed marine combat operations. Good terrain for ranching, but also perfect for controlling movement. Every escape route you're thinking about right now, we've been watching them, documenting them, preparing for exactly this moment. Every piece of equipment you brought, every tactic you tried, every connection you revealed, it's all part of building a bigger picture. Sarah's voice came through his secure channel, providing updates from her position in the reinforced barn that had become an impromptu tactical operations center. Federal teams are moving in from all directions. They've got everything: financial records, shipping manifests, connections to the Sacramento operation, even have drone footage of the classified equipment being moved through the abandoned Carson place. Her tone carried quiet amazement at how months of careful preparation had culminated in this moment. The evidence chain is complete. They won't be able to hide behind shell companies anymore. The contractors, already withdrawing into the darkness, watched through their own tactical equipment as federal teams began systematic containment maneuvers. Their command channel carried professional assessment of what they were witnessing, each observation confirming what Mike had intended them to understand. "This isn't just local law enforcement," one operator observed. "These are experienced tactical teams, probably FBI or DEA. The way they're moving, containing, documenting. Someone's been planning this for months. We walked right into a federal operation." Through his thermal scope, Mike tracked the judge's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control of his disintegrating organization. The gang leader was trying to contact his Sacramento connections, unaware that those communications were being monitored and recorded as evidence of broader conspiracy. Each call, each attempt at coordinating resistance only served to provide more documentation of criminal enterprise. "Your employers won't be able to help," Mike informed him through the ranch's broadcast system, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had planned for every contingency. "They're dealing with their own problems right now. Turns out, when you document enough connections between criminal organizations and classified military equipment, federal response becomes pretty comprehensive. Those shell companies buying up ranches, the fake development projects, the weapons being moved through supposedly abandoned properties, it's all connected now, all documented, all leading back to people who thought they were untouchable." Old Man Peter's voice carried quiet satisfaction through the secure channel as he monitored federal movements from his position. "Feds just breached the old Miller place," he reported, naming one of the first ranches the Mountain Kings had forced into sale. "Found exactly what you said they would. Weapons caches, military gear, everything needed to prove where this operation really leads. They're documenting connection points to at least 3 other criminal organizations, all tied to that Sacramento operation you identified." The Mountain Kings' remaining coherence dissolved as federal teams began announcing themselves through professional-grade sound systems. The gang members, now understanding the true nature of their situation, started breaking into smaller groups, each seeking individual escape. But every route they tried had been anticipated, prepared for, turned into another piece of evidence in a much larger investigation. Ricardo Martinez, Marcus Wheeler, a federal tactical commander, announced through crystal-clear broadcast equipment that covered the entire valley. "This is a joint FBI-DEA operation. We have federal warrants for your arrest based on documented evidence of organized criminal activity, weapons trafficking, and conspiracy across state lines. The entire area is contained. All evidence has been documented. Your connections to Sacramento have been compromised. Surrender now and cooperate with federal authorities." Through his thermal scope, Mike watched the judge's final attempt at resistance crumble in real time. The gang leaders' expensive tactical gear and weapons meant nothing now. They had become evidence rather than advantages, each piece documenting connections to larger criminal enterprises. His professional contractors were already gone, melting away into the darkness, but leaving behind documented proof of how criminal organizations were attempting to militarize their operations. This was never about protecting just the ranch, was it? Sarah asked quietly through their secure channel, watching federal teams methodically contain and arrest gang members who had thought themselves untouchable. You knew about their operation. From the start, used Thunder Valley as bait to draw them into showing their whole organization. All those months of preparation, the security upgrades, the careful documentation, you were building something bigger than just defense. Sometimes the best way to stop a threat isn't through direct confrontation, Mike replied, his voice carrying the experience of countless combat operations in places where victory wasn't about fighting, but about understanding. It's about seeing the bigger picture, recognizing patterns that others miss. The Mountain Kings weren't just another gang. They were a symptom of something larger, something that was transforming criminal enterprises into military-style operations. Had to be stopped before it spread further. The federal tactical teams moved with professional precision, their containment pattern closing steadily around the now scattered gang members. Each arrest was documented, each piece of evidence carefully logged, creating an unbreakable chain of proof, leading back to organizations that had thought themselves beyond the reach of law enforcement. The judge's final surrender came not with dramatic resistance, but with the quiet desperation of someone realizing they'd been completely outmaneuvered. His expensive tactical gear, his weapons, his attempts at military-style organization, all of it had been turned into evidence by someone who actually understood combat operations, who had seen the larger threat behind simple gang activity. Dawn began breaking over Thunder Valley Ranch as federal teams completed their systematic containment and arrest operation. The Mountain Kings' attempt at territorial expansion had been transformed into documented proof of criminal conspiracy. Their professional contractors' tactical expertise used to provide credible witness to how criminal organizations were evolving, militarizing, becoming something more dangerous than traditional gang activity. Sarah found Mike in his usual morning position on the North Tower, watching the last federal vehicles escort their prisoners from the valley. The morning light revealed the full scope of the operation. Multiple law enforcement agencies coordinating seamlessly, evidence teams documenting every connection, the carefully constructed case that would dismantle not just a local gang, but an entire network of criminal enterprise. The ranchers will be able to return now, she observed, understanding finally reaching deeper than just one night's operation. The ones who were forced out, who lost their land to shell companies and fake development projects. This wasn't just about stopping criminal activity, it was about restoring something that mattered. Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful as he secured his tactical equipment, the tools that had helped transform a simple ranch into the focal point of a major federal operation. That was always the real objective, he confirmed, watching the valley return to its natural peace. Not just stopping their operation, but reversing the damage they'd done. Sometimes the best victory isn't about defeating an enemy. It's about protecting what matters, about ensuring that people who think themselves above the law learn that there are always consequences. The morning sun painted long shadows across Thunder Valley Ranch as the operation concluded. Mike had spent months preparing this battlefield, using his combat experience not just to fight, but to create a situation where fighting became unnecessary. The Mountain Kings had tried to use military tactics and professional contractors to seize control of the valley, never realizing they were providing exactly the evidence needed to ensure their own downfall, to expose a growing threat of militarized criminal organizations. Through his spotting scope, Mike watched the final federal teams complete their evidence collection. The gang's attempt at sophisticated criminal enterprise had been dismantled not through direct confrontation, but through careful preparation and patience. The same skills that had once made him a legendary Marine Scout sniper, now used to protect something bigger than just one ranch. "It's over then?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Understanding dawned in her eyes as she watched Mike continue his methodical observation of the valley. No, not over. This was just one operation, wasn't it? There are other organizations out there, other criminals trying to militarize their operations. This was about sending a message. Mike's slight smile confirmed her assessment. The Mountain Kings had been stopped, their criminal enterprise dismantled, but the real victory was in demonstrating that someone was watching, someone who understood the evolution of criminal tactics and had the skills to stop them. Sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't a rifle or tactical gear. It was the patience to watch, to understand, to turn an enemy's strengths into the very evidence that would ensure their downfall. The morning breeze carried the smell of sage and cattle across Thunder Valley Ranch as the last federal vehicles disappeared into the distance. The valley would return to its peaceful routine, but something had changed. Criminal organizations thinking about militarizing their operations would think twice now, understanding that sometimes the most dangerous opponent wasn't the one that looked threatening, but the one patient enough to turn their own tactics against them. The aftermath of the Mountain King's downfall transformed Thunder Valley Ranch into the center of intense activity. Local and national media descended on Pine Ridge, their satellite trucks and camera crews creating an odd contrast against the pastoral landscape. Mike watched from his usual position in the North Tower as reporters attempted to piece together the story of how a seemingly simple ranch had become the focal point of a major federal operation. "They're calling you a hero," Sarah commented, bringing his morning coffee as camera crews set up for another day of coverage. "Local rancher exposes criminal conspiracy, helps federal authorities dismantle weapons trafficking operation, makes for good headlines." Her tone carried amusement at how the media was struggling to capture the full scope of what had happened. Mike's response was characteristically measured, his eyes never leaving the spotting scope as he maintained his habitual surveillance of the valley. Let them tell their stories. What matters is what comes next. His focus was already shifting to the broader implications of their operation, to the work that needed to be done to restore what the Mountain Kings had damaged. The first signs of that restoration began appearing within days. Federal authorities, armed with evidence gathered during the operation, began untangling the web of shell companies and fake development projects that had been used to seize control of local ranches. Property records were reviewed, fraudulent transactions reversed, stolen land returned to its rightful owners. Old Man Carson was among the first to return, his broken arm still in a cast as he reclaimed the ranch his family had worked for 3 generations. "Never thought I'd see this place again," he admitted to Mike, surveying his recovered property with tears in his eyes. "They made it seem so official, all those companies and lawyers. Never realized it was all just a front for something bigger." Through his surveillance network, now being used to monitor the valley's recovery, Mike watched similar scenes play out across the region. Families returning to their land, communities rebuilding, the careful work of healing beginning. But beneath the surface of restoration, he noted other patterns emerging. "Got word from my federal contacts," Sarah reported one morning, a week after the operation. "They're finding similar organizations in other states, criminal enterprises using military tactics, professional contractors, sophisticated business. Fronts. What happened here is making them look closer at patterns they'd missed before." Mike nodded, having expected this development. The Mountain Kings hadn't been unique. They were just one example of how criminal organizations were evolving, becoming more sophisticated in their operations. His operation at Thunder Valley Ranch hadn't just stopped one gang, it had exposed a growing trend that needed to be addressed. The media attention brought other changes to the valley. Security consultants began arriving, offering services to local ranchers who wanted to protect their recovered properties. Mike watched their operations with professional interest, noting how they attempted to copy what they thought they understood. About Thunder Valley's defenses, "They're missing the point," he commented to Old Man Peters as they observed another security team installing expensive systems at a neighboring ranch. "It's not about having the best equipment or the most sophisticated defenses. It's about understanding how your opponent thinks, how they operate, how to turn their own tactics against them." The federal investigation continued expanding, using evidence gathered at Thunder Valley Ranch to trace connections to larger criminal enterprises. Mike's careful documentation had provided a roadmap, showing how local gang activity connected to sophisticated weapons trafficking operations, how criminal organizations were attempting to militarize their operations across multiple states. Sacramento. "Operations been completely compromised," Sarah reported, reviewing updates from their federal contacts. "Your evidence chain led them straight to Marcus Wheeler's organization. They're finding connections to similar operations in 3 other states, all using the same pattern: local gangs as cover, professional contractors for muscle, legitimate businesses as fronts." The local community's response to these revelations was mixed. Some celebrated the exposure of corruption that had threatened their way of life. Others worried about retaliation, about other criminal organizations seeing the valley as a target. Mike's role in these discussions remained carefully measured, his combat experience telling him that the real work was just beginning. "People need to understand," he explained during a community meeting at Jenny's Diner. "What happened here wasn't just about stopping one gang. It was about recognizing patterns, about seeing how criminal enterprises are evolving. The mountain. Kings were just one example of something larger, organizations trying to use military tactics and professional expertise for criminal purposes." His words carried weight, backed by the evidence of what Thunder Valley Ranch had helped expose. The federal operation had revealed more than just local criminal activity. It had demonstrated how sophisticated these organizations had become, how they were adapting military tactics and professional expertise to their operations. The return of displaced ranchers continued throughout the month, each family bringing stories of how the Mountain Kings had used seemingly legitimate business practices to force them from their land. Mike worked with federal authorities to ensure each return was properly documented, creating a record that would help prevent similar schemes in the future. "It's not just about getting the land back," he explained to Sarah as they watched another family reclaim their property. "It's about understanding how they lost it in the first place, about recognizing the patterns so it can't happen again. Criminal organizations are adapting, becoming more sophisticated. Communities need to adapt too. The media's attention eventually began to fade, but the changes in the valley remained. Ranchers who had once seen security as an unnecessary expense now understood the importance of awareness, of recognizing patterns, of being prepared for more sophisticated threats than simple rustlers or local troublemakers. Mike's role evolved too. His expertise, no longer hidden behind the facade of a simple rancher, became a valuable resource for the community. But his approach remained characteristically measured, focused on teaching awareness and understanding rather than just implementing security measures. The best defense isn't about having the most expensive equipment or the strongest fortifications, he explained during a workshop for local ranchers. It's about understanding how threats evolve, how to recognize patterns, how to prepare for the kind of sophisticated operations we're seeing more often now. Through his surveillance network, Mike continued monitoring the valley's recovery, watching for signs of other organizations that might try to fill the void left by the Mountain Kings. His combat experience told him that nature abhors a vacuum. Other criminal enterprises would be studying what happened, learning lessons, adapting their tactics. "They'll be more careful next time," he observed to Sarah during their morning briefing. "What happened here? It's changing how these organizations operate. They'll be looking for new ways to hide their activities, new covers for their operations. We need to be ready for that." The federal investigation's ripple effects continued spreading, touching organizations and operations far beyond the valley. Mike's careful documentation had provided a template for identifying similar patterns in other regions, helping authorities recognize signs of criminal enterprises attempting to militarize their operations. Thunder Valley Ranch itself remained a symbol of resistance, a reminder that sometimes the most effective defense came from understanding rather than confrontation. Mike maintained his routine, his daily observations, his careful monitoring of the valley. But now others understood what lay beneath his seemingly simple rancher's existence, the tactical mind that had turned criminal sophistication into evidence, that had exposed a growing threat to rural communities across the country. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and longer shadows to Thunder Valley Ranch, Mike reflected on how completely their operation had transformed the valley. The visible changes, returned properties, rebuilt communities, increased awareness were significant. But the deeper impact, the exposure of how criminal enterprises were evolving and the demonstration of how to counter them would have lasting effects far beyond their quiet corner of the country. The morning sun painted long shadows across the valley as Mike maintained his watch, his combat-trained eyes scanning for the patterns others might miss. The Mountain Kings were gone, their sophisticated operation dismantled, but the lessons learned from their downfall would continue protecting communities that faced similar threats. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important victory wasn't in the battle itself, but in what it taught others about recognizing and resisting evolving threats to their way of life. 2 months after the Mountain King's downfall, Thunder Valley Ranch had settled into a new normal. The media circus had departed, federal investigators had concluded their primary evidence gathering, and the valley's rhythms had largely returned to their agricultural patterns. But subtle changes remained, visible to those who knew where to look. Mike stood in his usual morning position, surveying the valley through his spotting scope. The practice, once necessary for security, had become a ritual of vigilance that the community now understood differently. Local ranchers had started their own observation routines, maintaining informal networks that shared information about unusual activities or suspicious patterns. "Got an interesting call from the FBI this morning," Sarah reported, joining him with their usual coffee. "They're using your documentation methods as a template for other rural communities facing similar threats. Your system of gathering intelligence, tracking patterns, building evidence chains. It's becoming a model for dealing with sophisticated criminal operations." Mike nodded, adjusting his scope to track movement along the valley's northern access road. Just routine agricultural traffic, but old habits died hard. "Communities need to understand what they're facing," he replied. "Criminal organizations are evolving, adopting military tactics, using professional expertise. Traditional security measures aren't enough anymore." The valley itself stood as testament to this new reality. Ranchers who had recovered their properties now approached security differently, not just installing better equipment, but learning to recognize patterns, to understand how sophisticated threats operated. Mike's experience had taught them that awareness and preparation were more valuable than mere fortification. "Carson's son spotted something interesting yesterday," Sarah continued, reviewing notes on her tablet. "Group of surveyors working near their property line. Seemed professional, had all the right paperwork, but something felt off about their equipment setup. She glanced at Mike. He remembered what you taught him about recognizing patterns. Mike's slight smile acknowledged the significance. The younger Carson had once been skeptical of such vigilance, but experience had taught him valuable lessons. What did he do about it? Documented everything. Photographs, notes, patterns of movement. Turned out they were advanced scouts for another organization trying to establish operations in the region. Sarah's tone carried satisfaction. Federal authorities are already tracking their connections to 3 other states. The morning sun climbed higher as they discussed how the valley had changed. Thunder Valley Ranch had become more than just a working cattle operation. It was now a symbol of how rural communities could resist sophisticated criminal enterprises. Mike's methods, born from combat experience, had evolved into a template for protecting agricultural regions from modern threats. "Got word from Peters," Sarah added, checking messages on her secure phone. "That security consulting firm from Sacramento wants to interview you again. They're developing training programs for rural property protection. Want your input on recognizing military-style tactics in criminal operations." Mike's response was characteristically measured. "Might be worth considering. People need to understand. These aren't just local gangs anymore. Organizations are adapting, using professional contractors, military equipment. Communities need to adapt too." Ranch hands now carried sophisticated communication equipment, maintaining constant contact through encrypted channels. Property owners had learned to document unusual activities, to recognize patterns that might indicate surveillance or preparation for criminal operations. The valley had become more resilient, not through force, but through understanding and preparation. Federal task force is expanding, Sarah reported, reviewing latest updates from their contacts. They're finding similar patterns in other regions. Criminal organizations using military tactics, professional contractors, sophisticated business fronts. What happened here opened their eyes to something bigger. Mike nodded, having expected this development. The Mountain Kings hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a larger trend. Criminal enterprises were evolving, becoming more sophisticated in their operations. Thunder Valley's experience had helped authorities recognize and respond to this emerging threat. The morning's peace was briefly interrupted by the arrival of state police vehicles, routine patrol now, not crisis response. Law enforcement had also adapted, learning from the valley's experience. They understood now that rural communities faced more sophisticated threats than traditional criminal activity. "Thing about tactical evolution," Mike observed, watching. "The patrol vehicles move through their standard route. It works both ways. Organizations adapt, become more sophisticated, but communities can adapt too. Learn to recognize patterns, prepare for different kinds of threats." Sarah understood the deeper meaning behind his words. Thunder Valley Ranch had demonstrated that resistance didn't always require direct confrontation. Sometimes the most effective defense came from understanding, from turning an opponent's sophistication into evidence that could be used against them. The valley's transformation was subtle but significant. Ranchers who had once competed now shared information, maintaining informal networks that helped identify potential threats. Properties that had been recovered from criminal control now served as examples of resilient security, demonstrating how rural communities could protect themselves from modern threats. "Got another inquiry from that journalist in Washington," Sarah mentioned, checking her messages. "She's doing a series on evolution of rural crime, how criminal organizations are adapting military tactics for civilian operations. Wants to use Thunder Valley as a case study." Mike considered this as he continued his morning surveillance. Their experience could help other communities recognize and resist similar threats. But it had to be presented carefully, focusing on awareness and preparation rather than just recounting conflict. The morning breeze carried the smell of sage and cattle across Thunder Valley Ranch as Mike reflected on how completely their operation had transformed both the valley and its approach to security. The visible changes, returned properties, enhanced communication networks, increased community awareness were significant. But the deeper impact, the understanding of how to recognize and resist sophisticated criminal operations, would have lasting effects far beyond their quiet corner of the country. Thunder Valley Ranch had become more than just a cattle operation that resisted criminal takeover. It was now a model for how rural communities could adapt to evolving threats, how agricultural regions could protect themselves from organizations that used military tactics and professional expertise for criminal purposes. The morning sun climbed higher over the valley as Mike maintained his watch, his combat-trained eyes scanning for the patterns others might miss. The Mountain Kings were gone, their sophisticated operation dismantled, but the lessons learned from their downfall continued protecting communities that face similar threats. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important victory wasn't in the battle itself, but in what it taught others about recognizing and resisting evolving threats to their way of life. If you enjoyed this thrilling tale of how a retired Marine sniper turned rancher outsmarted a dangerous criminal organization, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Each week, we bring you incredible true stories of ordinary people who prove to be extraordinary when faced with dangerous situations. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell to ensure you never miss our latest stories of courage, tactical brilliance and triumph against overwhelming odds. Your support makes it possible for us to keep sharing these remarkable stories. Plus, we have some truly exceptional content coming up that you won't want to miss. Join our growing community of listeners who appreciate tales of real-life heroes, who remind us that appearances can be deceiving and that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one that looks fierce, but the one patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.